It's my great pleasure to introduce William Struble. Will comes to us as a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Arizona. He got his PhD from the University of Oregon. During those times, Will's received a number of awards in recognition of his research contributions and has served as the PI and co-PI on several research proposals. Will's really a tectonic geomorphologist. He's focused on reading landscapes in order to determine how tectonic and climatic forces interact to shape the spectacular landforms we have around us. So today, will be talking about interpreting these processes in terms of natural hazards and reading landscape morphologies to learn more about some of the processes that affect people's lives. So yeah, take it away, Will.
Well, thank you, Ethan, for that introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here. For those of you who I've had a chance to meet with over the past day or so, I've really had a great time chatting with all of you about the awesome research that's being done here at UTIG and how you all see that research going forward into the future, and especially research revolving around the broad theme of natural hazards, which I'll be talking about today. And I'll specifically be focusing in on landslide processes and, importantly, how they operate over a range of timescales. So in the first half of the talk, we'll talk about short timescale processes that result in the triggering of bedrock landslides and occasionally the formation of landslide-dammed lakes, like this example here on my title slide. This is Esmond Lake, which is a landslide-dammed lake in the Oregon Coast Range. And then we'll also talk about landslide processes and how they operate over geologic time to set the morphology of steep landscapes and encode climate and tectonic processes within the morphology of the landscape. And importantly, sets a template for where natural hazards occur and how likely they are. But before I get into too much detail on landslides specifically, I want to provide a brief, slides are changing. Yeah, there we go. Brief overview and framework for how geomorphologists like myself think about the evolution of landscapes. So we know that landscapes evolve due to processes that result over very large spatial and temporal scales. This is what I often like to refer to as national park level landscape evolution. So you'll go to a national park like the Grand Canyon in Arizona, and you'll see many interpretive signs that describe how the canyon has evolved over millions of years due to uplift of the Colorado Plateau and incision of the Colorado River. And indeed, geomorphologists like myself have built an understanding of how landscapes evolve due to these long timescale processes, such as river incision, movement of sediment across hill slopes, and how these processes interact with climate and tectonics. And we often construct what we call landscape evolution models, like this example on the bottom right, which uses our mathematical understanding of how rivers erode and how hill slopes move sediment in order to interpret landscapes over long timescales. So in this example here, you can see river networks represented by the black lines growing and shrinking over time. In this case, the model runtime is about 10 million years. And you can see the hill slopes and the drainage divides subsequently following those river networks as they shift in time and space. But we also know that landscapes evolve due to event processes as well. And as a tectonic geomorphologist who's often interested in hill slope processes, the first process that comes to mind to me is landslides. Now, landslides can move and store significant amounts of sediment as well as organic material and soil carbon. They can impound rivers and create lakes. And importantly, they present a significant hazard to us during large earthquakes and rain events. So the upper two figures here correspond with some notable earthquake-triggered landslide events, such as the Hokkaido earthquake in Japan in 2018 and the Kaikoura earthquake on the South Island of New Zealand in 2016. Whereas the bottom two examples correspond with notable precipitation-triggered landslides. So in 2014, the Oso landslide occurred on the North Fork Stillaguamish River in Western Washington and is the deadliest single landslide in US history. And then in 2021, there were a series of post-fire debris flows that occurred in the Columbia River Gorge on the border of Oregon and Washington after a major wildfire there that burned in 2017. Now, importantly, these landslides can occur as a part of a hazards cascade as well. So the landslides themselves present a hazard, but if they were to, say, dam a river and create a lake, that lake is now a hazard because that dam may fail catastrophically and release a large outburst flood. So these present significant hazards, but one question I want to consider, at least in the second half of the talk, is how do these landslide processes drive the evolution of landscapes over long time scales as well? So we have these two end member processes. We have landslides, which act abruptly and in a spatially confined fashion, and they present a significant hazard. And then we have long timescale processes that act over very large spatial scales. So we have river incision, movement of sediment across hill slopes, and these processes interact with climate and tectonics and also the biosphere. Now, often these disparate timescale processes are studied in isolation, but I think it's really important that we consider them in tandem if we want to develop a holistic understanding of how landscapes evolve and record processes and hazards. So today, we're going to specifically focus on landslide processes at limited spatial scales, but also we'll consider how they play into longer timescale landscape evolution. And to do this, I'm going to put forward here a fairly simple spatial and temporal Cartesian framework where our x-axis here is our temporal axis, increasing in timescale from left to right, and our y-axis is the spatial axis, increasing in spatial scale from bottom to top. So we have these four quadrants that we can populate with a range of different processes within the geosciences. And one of the reasons that I love being a geomorphologist is it involves processes that fall within and span each of these quadrants. And that's one of the reasons why I would love to be here at UTIG, because geomorphology often involves many collaborations with other disciplines that fall within each of these quadrants. So disciplines from tectonics to surface processes and geodynamics. And I would be really excited to work across those typical disciplinary bounds and integrate those fields. And I've already worked on a wide variety of projects in each of these quadrants. But again, today we're going to focus on the bottom two quadrants in that we're going to consider landslides as processes that occur relatively discretely in space, but have very different implications in terms of the time scale of interest. And we're going to specifically consider two questions throughout this talk. During the first half of the talk, we're going to consider the processes that are most responsible for triggering bedrock landslides in the Oregon Coast Range. And in the second half of the talk, we'll consider how debris flows set the morphology of steep landscapes. And we're going to go ahead and jump into the Oregon Coast Range to start. So the Oregon Coast Range is situated along the Cascadia Subduction Zone, where the Juan de Fuca plate is subducting under the northwestern margin of North America. It's situated within the forearc, so we're situated between the trench and the active volcanic arc in the Cascades. It's an area of steep topography where we often see many shallow landslides and debris flows triggered during the rainy season. If you go into the landscape, though, you'll find many thousands to tens of thousands of bedrock landslides and hundreds of landslide-dammed lakes. But we rarely see these bedrock landslides triggered. So prior to my PhD, it was assumed by most geologists in the Northwest that since we don't see these bedrock landslides trigger with much regularity during rain events, they must be triggered by large subduction zone earthquakes. Now we know that the last megathrust earthquake in the Northwest occurred on January 26th of 1700. But to date, no landslide has ever been dated with accuracy that we need in order to link slide occurrence with that particular earthquake. Now, this question of are these landslides triggered by earthquakes is an important one for not only quantifying landslide hazards in the Pacific Northwest, but it's also important for informing shaking hazard. Because if we did find a landslide or more than one landslide that was triggered by the last earthquake, that could help us then inform the distribution of shaking that was necessary to trigger those landslides. And indeed, this is clearly an important process when we go to other landscapes that have experienced significant earthquakes. So the Wenchuan earthquake in China in 2008, and the Kaikoura earthquake in New Zealand in 2016, both triggered tens to hundreds of thousands of bedrock landslides. For the case of the Kaikoura earthquake, it also produced over 150 landslide-dammed lakes. And some of those lakes did fail catastrophically and produce outburst floods following large rain events. And then in 1959, a North American example is Quake Lake, which formed following a 7.3 magnitude earthquake near Yellowstone. So in this figure here, you can see the lake that formed behind this landslide deposit here, and here's the landslide scar. So this is clearly a process that's active during earthquakes and other landscapes. The question is, how common is it in the Pacific Northwest? So we have a contrast here where we have shallow landslides and debris flows that are quite common. So here you can see some valley bottoms that have been scoured up by debris flows following large rain events in 1996. But we have bedrock landslides that are abundant in the landscape, but we rarely see them observed. So this figure on the right, this is a LiDAR hillshade, so essentially a digital topographic map. On the left or the west side of this image, we can see steep uniform topography with uniform ridges and valleys. This is our locations where shallow landslides and debris flows predominate. But in other parts of this hillshade, we can see very broad, diffuse, hummocky hill slopes, kind of look like melted ice cream. These are all deep-seated bedrock landslides. And we have over 20,000 of these deep-seated bedrock landslides that have been mapped to date. And again, it's been assumed that most of these are coseismic. But again, none of these landslides have ever been dated with sufficient accuracy to link their timing with a known triggering event. So if we want to answer the question, what process triggers bedrock landslides in the Oregon Coast Range, we really need to go hunting for landslides that date to the last 1700 earthquake. And we need to do that with a technique that allows us to establish the ages of those landslides with the accuracy we need in order to make such a clear linkage between the two. So I just want to highlight briefly some of the tools that we might consider to do this. The first is radiocarbon or C14 dating. So essentially taking organic material from the landslide deposit to establish how old the deposit is. There are a few issues with this technique. First of all, the residence time of a piece of wood, for instance, might be quite long relative to the age of the deposit itself. So for instance, a tree might blow down in a windstorm, the wood from that tree is incorporated into the soil column, and then the landslide occurs sometime later. So when you're dating that piece of wood, you're not dating the landslide itself, but you're dating the wind event that killed the tree. And then also atmospheric C14 is not constant in the atmosphere with time. It varies, which means that you have to calibrate your C14 ages to arrive at a calendar year age. And this simply results in a lot of ambiguity in any final age you get. You can end up with multiple peaks in your distribution of possible ages or just a wide range of ages, which just limits our ability to link slide timing with a specific event. We can also use the roughness of landslides to determine how old they are. So the idea here is that young landslides tend to be quite rough, whereas old landslides tend to be quite smooth. So if we go to a landscape with landslides that have been dated independently, say from C14 dating, we can measure the roughness of those deposits. And then fitting a model to those roughness age data, we can then apply that model to many thousands of other landslides in the landscape to establish how old those landslide deposits are. Now, unfortunately, this technique can't be used with enough accuracy to link slide timing with a particular triggering event, but it is useful for developing an understanding of landslide rates in a particular area through time. And we'll come back to this technique a little bit later. So all this to say, we really need sub-annually accurate landslide ages if we really want to have a hope of linking landslide timing with a specific seismic or climatic event. So if we return to our lighter hillshade here, again, where we can see zones of deep-seated landsliding, I just want to zoom in to one particular landslide complex on the eastern half of our DEM, specifically this smaller bedrock landslide that has come down into this valley bottom, dammed a stream, and formed a lake. This is Burchard Lake, and it's one of over 200 landslide-dammed lakes that have been mapped to date in the Oregon Coast Range. And this lake also has drowned tugless fir trees in the lake, such as this example here. So we wonder, can we use these trees in any way to establish the age of the landslide deposit? So this brings us to dendrochronology. So tree rings preserve an annual climate record within the widths of their rings. And depending on the type of tree you work with or the landscape you're in, most tree rings are sensitive to either precipitation or temperature. So with Douglas fir, which is the species of tree I'm working with in this talk, they are primarily sensitive in the Northwest to precipitation. So in this example on the right, we would expect that these wide rings correspond with wet years and the narrow rings correspond with periods of drought. So we can go to the landscape and we can core living trees, like this example here in the schematic, and we can compile multiple measurements into what we call a tree ring chronology, which we can see in this example here. It looks kind of like a barcode, which is essentially a record of climate derived from those living trees. And in Western Oregon, our current living tree ring chronologies extend back about 800 years. You can then go and collect similar samples from dead trees, like this example here. You can measure those rings, and then you can compare the time series from those dead collected measurements to your living tree ring chronology to find out where they overlap the best, and therefore when the dead trees died. And this is indeed how we know when the last big earthquake happened. So these here are ghost forests in Willapa Bay on the southwestern coast of Washington. Brian Atwater and David Yamaguchi in the 1990s found that these ghost forests died sometime in the winter of 1699 to 1700. And then it was written records in Japan that noted the arrival of a tsunami, but there had been no shaking felt in Japan, that allowed them to then constrain the timing of the last earthquake to about 9 p.m. on January 26th of 1700. So here, I'll be showing how we applied the exact same technique to date landslide dam lakes throughout Western Oregon. So the black dots in this figure here correspond with our over 200 landslide dams in Western Oregon. And to illustrate how we do this, I'm going to take us first to Klickitat Lake, which is a landslide dam lake in the Central Oregon Coast Range near the city of Corvallis. So we go out to these sites, we see these ghost forests of large standing Douglas fir trees. We extract slabs from these trees, such as this example here. Ideally, we want slabs that have at least 100 rings for analysis, just to ensure that we can have a good correlation with our living tree ring chronologies. I just want to highlight the work of two particular undergrads who worked with me on this project, Jared Aguilar and Elizabeth Curtis, who's really instrumental in spending a lot of time sanding these samples down to a really fine polish so that we could actually measure even the smallest tree rings in these samples to ensure we weren't missing any particular years in our record. So we measure our tree ring measurements and we end up with something kind of like this. So this is an example from a living tree, but the time series always looks similar for dead trees. So in this example here, where we have ring width on the y-axis and calendar year on the x, we can see when the tree was young in the late 1500s, the rings are quite wide, and then the ring widths decrease through time. This is very typical for trees as they age. The rings tend to become smaller after their first few decades of living. We want to be able to compare trees of different ages though, and we also want to remove any decadal scale variation in tree ring width. So we're going to fit a spline to this time series, which we can see by this blue line, and detrending this time series by the spline, we arrive at what is essentially the interannual variability in tree ring width. So I'm going to plot up here now that interannual variability in ring width for one of our master chronologies in Western Oregon. This is from the Mary's Peak chronology near the city of Corvallis. Also, we can see that ring width index on the y-axis and calendar year on the x. On top of that, I'm going to place our time series collected from the dead trees at Klickitat Lake, shown by the red line. And we're going to cross-correlate these two time series. So we're going to essentially lag the two across each other until we find where they overlap the best as defined by a normalized correlation coefficient. And in this case, we find that the last ring formed in the winter of 1751. We also cored living trees on the landslide deposit. The idea is that the trees should be younger than the age of the deposit itself. And in this case, we found that those trees began growing about a decade or so after the landslide occurred sometime in the winter of 1751 to 52. Okay, so that's the technique as applied at Klickitat Lake. I'm just going to jump straight forward to our results from our sites in Western Oregon. So on the y-axis in this plot here, you can see our list of landslide dam lakes. The x-axis is calendar year age. The bullseye symbols correspond with sites where we had bark preserved on the trees. Bark ensures that we have the outermost growth increment in the trees, and it also allows us sometimes to determine the season in which the tree died. Unfortunately, many of our sites had significant decay in the samples, so we didn't always have bark preserved. So those sites have to be considered maximum ages, which correspond to the open circles with the arrows pointing to the right. I'm also plotting on this figure in this black line, the timing of the 1700 earthquake. So the big takeaway from this figure is that no landslide clearly corresponds to the last earthquake in 1700, but we do still have temporal clustering of landslides, most notably, at least for landslides that occurred sometime in the winter of 1889 to 1890. And they also spatially cluster down southwest of the city of Eugene, represented by the orange squares here. So we can dig through the historical records and we find that indeed there was major flooding in Western Oregon in early 1890. So January of 1890 was conspicuously snowy, especially by low elevation Western Oregon standards. And then that heavy snowfall was followed in February by a series of very warm, intense rainfall events, very consistent with the atmospheric rivers that we often see, responsible for some of the largest floods in the Northwest. And just given the historical narratives, it was likely the second largest flood in Western Oregon history. All right, so these results show that contrary to past strong assumptions that most of these bedrock landslides are earthquake triggered, these bedrock landslides are actually more closely linked with large scale precipitation events. But we can also use these landslide ages to build larger landslide age databases to interrogate landslide triggering mechanisms over longer timescales. So this is work that was led by my colleague Sean Lehusen, who's now at the USGS. And here we took my landslide dam lake ages and we measured the roughness of those deposits to then estimate the age of many thousands of landslides. So for instance, just to review, we have young landslides like this example here. This is Esmond Lake, where we have very rough deposits. And then older landslide dam lakes like Triangle Lake down here that have very smooth deposits. So again, creating a model of roughness age data, we can estimate the age of several thousand deposits, and we can see a small subset of those deposits here, where the old landslides are colored in blue and the younger landslides are in red. Now, again, this technique is not accurate enough to link slide timing to any particular event, but we can compare landslide distributions in space and time to different metrics for triggering. So for instance, if we were to compare landslide occurrence from this data set to metrics for shaking, such as peak ground acceleration or distance to the megathrust, we find that landslide occurrence is actually anti-correlated with those shaking proxies. So for instance, we would expect that we would have more landslides where we have less shaking, which doesn't quite jive with our intuition of how coseismic landslides work. But we do find that our landslide occurrence in this data set is fairly well correlated with mean annual precipitation, and just reinforces that most of these bedrock landslides are more clearly linked with precipitation patterns than they are to coseismic events. Okay, so we've established in the first half of the talk that precipitation is the primary bedrock landslide triggering mechanism in the Oregon Coast Range, contrary to past, again, very strong assumptions of coseismic triggering. And we can come to this conclusion because dendrochronology allows us to date these landslides with seasonal accuracy, and still pick out temporal clustering in our landslide age databases, most notably in February of 1890. Now, this work also raises more general questions about extreme geomorphic events, such as how and when they occur, how they're preserved in the geologic record, and also what their legacy is in terms of sediment and carbon that they store and move. And this all motivates several projects that I'd be super excited to pursue into the future here at UTIG. The first takes advantage of the data set I've already built. So even though we've amassed a large high-resolution age database for the Pacific Northwest, some work that some USGS colleagues and I published just about a year and a half ago showed that it is still very statistically reasonable that there are landslides associated with the last big earthquake that we just simply haven't found yet. So this means that continued landslide dating efforts are really necessary, not only in the Oregon Coast Range, but also moving further afield to other coseismic landslide-prone landscapes in the Northwest. In South America, during the Maui earthquake, there were more landslides actually triggered in the volcanic arc than there were in the forearc. So we're really excited to move further afield beyond the Coast Range to other landscapes. One observation that came out of this work that I didn't have time to talk about is that we found that these landslide dam lakes occur in particular parts of the landscape. So there are particular drainage areas and valley widths where we see that these lakes tend to cluster. Now, this is an important observation because it suggests that if landslide dam lakes begin to form outside of this ideal location, that suggests that hazard from outburst floods may be higher in other parts of the landscape. But it also raises mechanistic questions about what promotes the preservation of these landslide dam lakes in these locations. And one mechanism that we proposed in our paper a couple years ago was that large wood may impact the preservation of these landslide dam lakes. So either structurally supporting the deposit itself, or because they accumulate near the outlet of these lakes, they also perhaps inhibit the flashiness of the hydrograph and inhibit incision into the landslide deposit itself. One of my colleagues on this work, as a part of his master's thesis, he investigated the sedimentation history of several of these landslide dam lakes. But a major question, given these lakes serve as significant accommodation space for sediment, is how much carbon are they storing? The Pacific Northwest is a very carbon-rich landscape. So these cores that he collected originally to investigate sedimentation rate are also very useful as a seed data set to consider how much carbon may be sequestered in these landslide dam lakes. And then finally, there's work that's shown that trees and forests can damp seismic waves of particular frequencies. But there's been no work, as far as I'm aware, that investigates how this might impact the triggering of coseismic landslides, perhaps by inhibiting the triggering of coseismic slides. Now, I just submitted a seed proposal about 3 weeks ago to the newly created Cascadia Region Earthquake Science Center, or Crescent, where in this work we would go out to an experimental forest in Western Oregon, where there's a patchwork of logged slopes, industrially replanted slopes, and old growth forests, to install seismic arrays and accelerometers on trees to investigate how trees interact with seismic waves in this region. And then we'd use any seed data from that proposal to craft a full proposal to either NASA or NSF. And again, I just want to reemphasize that all of these projects fall under the broad umbrella of where, when, and why, and importantly, how landslides impact landscapes, and importantly, define landslide hazards. Okay, So just returning to our space-time diagram here, we've shown that dendrochronology allows us to date landslides with seasonal accuracy, which importantly allows us to then link slide timing with particular triggering events, notably flooding. And if we scale up to larger spatial scales, we can find that Western Oregon landslides are primarily precipitation triggered. But we know that these bedrock landslides impact landscapes over long time scales as well. So for instance, landslide dams contribute to long-term sediment flux and storage in steep landscapes. And importantly, landslides and landslide-derived sediment also modulate how landscapes are going to respond over long time scales to climate and tectonics. So this really leads nicely into the second half of the talk, where we'll consider the question of how do debris flows set the form of steep landscapes. And this is a question that is really fundamental for our ability to quantitatively link Earth surface processes to landscape morphology in steep landscapes, especially if we hope to decode landscapes for hazard. Okay, so like I mentioned at the start of my talk, we often like to discretize landscapes into rivers and hill slopes. And one reason we do this is because over the past several decades, there's been a lot of work in the geomorphology community formulating and testing what we call geomorphic transport laws, which are essentially mathematical ways to describe the processes that are active in a particular part of the landscape and link those processes with particular landforms that those processes create. So for instance, in rivers, we often consider erosion to be proportional to slope, as well as the river's upstream drainage area, which is usually related to the river's discharge. This is sort of our classical stream power approach, but there are also other models that take into account the abrasive effects of sediment, as well as thresholds required to transport sediment. On hill slopes, we often consider erosion to be proportional to the convexity of hill slopes, especially the convexity at the hilltops. This is our slope-dependent transport model, or what we often refer to as diffusion. Now, given a landscape that's uplifting at a steady rate and has uniform lithology, so all else equal, we would expect that steep rivers and sharp hilltops should correlate with fast uplift and erosion rates. These are expectations from these geomorphic transport laws. We can test these expectations by going to natural landscapes. So here we're in the San Gabriel Mountains in Southern California. This is work from DiBiase and Whipple in 2011. Here they color the drainage networks by how steep the channels are. So we can see more steep channels in the east corresponding with the orange channels, less steep channels overall in the west. They've colored the watersheds here by catchment averaged erosion rate as measured with cosmogenic beryllium-10. So in the east here, we can see fast erosion rates and more slow in the west. And then importantly, they also found that uplift rates as measured with apatite uranium thorium helium dating and apatite fission tract dating, that uplift rates were faster in the east, slower in the west. So in this case, just from map view, we can see that steep channels tend to correspond with fast uplift and erosion rates. We can do something similar with hilltops. So we often find that very broad, gentle hilltops correspond with slow erosion rates, and then very sharp hilltops on hill slopes that tend to be quite steep tend to correspond with fast erosion rates. We can go to natural landscapes and measure hilltop curvature. So this is a map of hilltop curvature of Western Oregon, in this case created with continuous wavelet transforms on over 43,000 square kilometers of 1 meter LiDAR data, amounting to over 90 million hilltop pixels. And we can see here regions of the Coast Range shown by the yellow colors that correspond with sharp hilltops in the core of the Coast Range and fast erosion rates, and other portions of the Coast Range and the Willamette Valley near Eugene, shown in blue, that correspond with slowly eroding catchments and broad, gentle hilltops. Now, unfortunately, these morphologic proxies for uplift and erosion begin to break down when we go to rapidly eroding landscapes. So in fluvial channels, we find that channels begin to reach a threshold steepness beyond which they're no longer sensitive to erosion rate. And then we also find the debris flows become the dominant incisional process in these steepland valleys. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. On hilltops, we find that we can no longer use it as an accurate proxy for erosion rate when soils become patchy. This occurs when erosion rate begins to outpace the soil production rate. Ideally, we want those two to be roughly in balance because we need a soil mantled landscape to apply hilltop curvature. And then also we found just a couple years ago that it actually becomes quite hard to just recover an accurate curvature measurement when hilltops become conspicuously sharp, especially when you're trying to remove topographic noise from bioturbation like tree throw or gopher mounds. Okay, So when we go to steep landscapes like the San Gabriel Mountains in Southern California, it becomes clear that we can't simply carve up the landscape into rivers and hill slopes. So for instance, we often find that steep valley networks, like those shown in red here, are not carved by rivers. So these are non-fluvial landscapes. And these non-fluvial valleys account for a significant proportion of relief and channel length in these steep landscapes. But unfortunately, we don't have a quantitative theory for how this part of the landscape evolves. So everything in red here, we don't have a mathematical framework to link the erosive processes that are active in that part of the landscape to the resulting morphology. So throughout my postdoc, I've been investigating the questions of, first of all, how do debris flows drive landscape evolution over geologic timescales? And then importantly, how do these steepland valleys encode any sort of tectonic or climatic information within their morphology? So first, I'm going to talk briefly about what debris flows are and where they occur, and then we'll move forward to addressing these two specific questions. So as we often see in the news, wildfires are an ever-present hazard in many steep landscapes, especially in arid locations. But the hazard from the fire isn't over once the fire's out, but the hazard remains high, primarily in the form of post-fire debris flows. So we can see a few notable examples here of some post-fire debris flows. This is a debris flow that scoured the soil and sediment off a hill slope in the Cascade Range following the 2017 Millie fire. On the right, I'm going to show a video of a debris flow that occurred following the 2018 Buzzard fire in the Gila Mountains in New Mexico. So we'll be able to see runoff beginning to accumulate in this valley bottom, and then a debris flow is going to move through the frame. Now, clearly, these present hazards over short timescales. But we're going to think about how these sorts of processes integrate over geologic time. And we're going to start by identifying morphologic metrics or morphometrics that are likely a result of debris flow erosion that we can pull from the landscape and test whether or not they correlate with uplift and erosion rate. And to do this, we're going to remain in the San Gabriel Mountains in Southern California. The upper map here on the right, I'm coloring watersheds here by catchment averaged erosion rate. This might look familiar from the channel steepness figure I showed earlier from DiBiase and Whipple, where we have fast erosion rates in the east and slow erosion rates in the west. The bottom panel here, I've colored the watersheds by a metric that I've derived from quantitative analysis of watershed morphology. And in this case, it quantifies the downstream extent of debris flow dominated valleys. And that's a metric that we've termed ADF. So conceptually, you can think of ADF that's large as corresponding to long debris flow channels, usually correlating with greater relief, whereas small ADF values tend to correspond with short debris flow channels and less relief. So broadly speaking, it appears just from map view that there's a correlation between erosion rate and ADF, and we can see graphically on the left that that is the case. So I have ADF on the y-axis here, erosion rate on the x. The black circles here correspond to each of the watersheds in this data set. The gray lines correspond to a series of bootstrapped linear fits, and the red lines correspond to 95% confidence intervals. So my postdoc has been spent characterizing the relationship between steepland metrics like ADF and uplift and erosion rate. And in this case, we can see that in some fashion, tectonics appears to be encoded within these steepland valley networks, which is important because in places like the San Gabriel Mountains, fluvial channel steepness and hilltop curvature tends to be fairly difficult to work with. But we can go to other landscapes too and make similar measurements of ADF. So in this figure here, I'm plotting again our San Gabriel Mountains watersheds, ADF values against erosion rate, although note that I've now switched to a logarithmic y-axis. I'm also plotting ADF values from watersheds in the Oregon Coast Range in blue and watersheds from the Idaho batholith in red. Now, importantly, we find that we still see linear correlations between ADF and erosion rate across landscapes, but clearly we see very dramatic differences in the relationship between ADF and erosion rate. So most notably, the very steep relationship, though still a statistically significant linear relationship in the Idaho batholith. Now we want to consider, well, why does steepland morphology vary with erosion rate so differently in these landscapes? And you may say, well, of course, they're going to vary differently. Lithology is going to vary between these landscapes. The climate is different. The absolute value of uplift rate is different. And you would be right to hypothesize that these are reasons why the relationship between morphology and uplift and erosion varies in these landscapes. But we want to develop a mechanistic understanding of how debris flow processes relate with morphology in order to interpret tectonics and climate. So in short, we need a geomorphic transport law for debris flows. So I'm going to illustrate how we've been testing one possible geomorphic transport law within the framework of a simple 1D landscape evolution model. On the left here, I'm showing a schematic of a valley profile where we have elevation against distance. And we're going to model changes in topography through time as a function of uplift rate, which produces topography, as well as fluvial incision and debris flow incision. And in this case, debris flow erosion will be proportional to the size of the debris flows, namely debris flow volume, as well as how often they occur, their velocity, and valley slope. And I'm just going to show very briefly some of the details of the incision law. So for our EDF term, erosion by debris flows, erosion in this case is going to be proportional to a debris flow efficiency coefficient. This includes our bedrock and debris flow properties, such as grain size and lithology, as well as how often our debris flows are occurring. Debris flow erosion will also be related to debris flow passage time, which is proportional to velocity. We have channel slope and debris flow depth terms, both raised to some exponents, as well as a threshold factor that reduces incision as the debris flow nears the end of its runout. Now, one of the key components of our work was identifying whether there are particular ranges of our alpha, our slope exponent, and beta, depth exponent, terms that produce generally physically reasonable landscapes. But we also did data model comparison in the San Gabriel Mountains to ensure that we can produce accurate morphology for particular alpha and beta values, and importantly, record relationships between morphology and uplift and erosion rate. Okay, so I'm going to jump to some of our model results. I'm showing here valley profiles corresponding to a series of 10 model runs across a range of uplift and erosion rates. So the red profiles, or the light red profiles, correspond to slow uplift and erosion rates of 0.1 millimeters per year, whereas the darker red corresponds to rates of 1 millimeters per year. And I'm showing the profiles in two slightly different ways. On the left-hand side, I'm showing our typical longitudinal profiles. This panel on the right here, I'm plotting the slope of these channels against drainage area in log-log space. This is a typical way that geomorphologists often like to look at valley profiles. In rivers that are carved fluvially, we often expect a power law relationship or a straight line in log-log space between slope and drainage area. So at larger drainage areas, this tends to correspond with being further downstream. However, importantly, in our model, we can see that at large drainage areas, we are recovering this power law relationship, but as we go upstream, we begin to approach near constant slopes, producing a curved relationship in slope area space. This is really important because it's been suggested that curved slope area data, which we see in many steep landscapes, is what we call a topographic signature of debris flows, and has really often been the target for most past efforts to try and reproduce steepland landscapes with any kind of debris flow geomorphic transport law. So importantly, we're reproducing that curved relationship, and we can see that we're producing systematically steeper channels for a given drainage area when uplift and erosion rate are fast. Most importantly, we're able to reproduce the relationship between morphology and erosion rate. So here I'm plotting again the ADF versus erosion rate data for the San Gabriel Mountains in black, and the blue circles correspond to our series of model runs, which we can see are falling within our confidence intervals here. Now, importantly, we aren't just reproducing the morphology of individual catchments, but we're reproducing the relationship between morphology and uplift and erosion rate across catchments, which is arguably much more important if we're trying to create a generalizable geomorphic transport law for debris flows. Now, we find that our model results are sensitive to a number of parameters that may help explain differences between each of these example landscapes. So for instance, parameters that include the effects of lithology are very important for producing accurate morphometrics, especially in terms of their relationship with uplift and erosion. We find that the relationship between uplift rate and debris flow properties is very important. So specifically, we find in the San Gabriel Mountains, you need either systematically larger or more frequent debris flows in the most rapidly uplifting catchments to reproduce accurate morphometrics. This makes sense from our understanding of sediment supply in steep landscapes, in that when you have rapid uplift rate, you need to evacuate that sediment. And to do so, you're probably going to need debris flows to either be bigger or occur more frequently. And then finally, when we're considering differences between morphology and erosion rate between landscapes, we often also need to consider differences in process in general, specifically for debris flows, how they're actually triggered and initiated. So in the San Gabriel Mountains, we find that debris flows are very closely linked with wildfire. And these are what we call entrainment-initiated debris flows. So essentially you have sediment that's progressively bulked as you have significant runoff that moves downstream. Whereas in the Oregon Coast Range, we see the debris flows initiate as discrete packages of sediment on the hill slopes in the form of shallow landslides that then mobilize into debris flows. And the Idaho batholith exhibits sort of a range of both of these behaviors. Now, importantly, this model by no means answers every question about debris flows or how they relate to steeple morphology, but they provide observational targets for future data collection efforts that allow us to better constrain any sort of debris flow incision law that we're hoping to create. So that's definitely one future part of our work, but a lot of our future work that we're really excited to pursue is related to regional scale mapping of metrics like ADF. So for instance, in this figure here, we've returned to the Oregon Coast Range, and we can see from catchments here, colored by ADF, perhaps a spatial distribution of uplift and erosion as defined by ADF. So importantly, we hope that metrics like this can allow us to map variations in uplift and erosion rate, but it also allows us to formulate and also refine our current debris flow hazard models. And this is especially useful because debris flow hazard models have usually been crafted in particular landscapes. So for instance, the USGS post-fire debris flow erosion model was crafted in the San Gabriel Mountains in Southern California. And when you try to quantify debris flow hazard in other landscapes with that model, you're essentially bringing the San Gabriels with you. So for instance, we tend to overestimate debris flow volumes in other Western US landscapes using the San Gabriel Mountains data because the San Gabriel Mountains, for whatever reason, tend to produce very large debris flows. So our hope is that metrics like this allow us to begin moving further afield beyond locations like the San Gabriel Mountains and begin amassing large data sets of debris flow hazard in other landscapes, especially in places where debris flows behave differently than they do in San Gabriel Mountains in Southern California. And then finally, by no means is this map a perfect map of the spatial distribution of uplift and erosion rate, but it's also going to take into account other factors such as lithology and structure. So for instance, we can see here this small patch of red. This is the Yachats basalt, which is on the central Oregon coast and is an area that is conspicuously steep and dissected compared to the surrounding sand and siltstones. So these sorts of maps will also then allow us to consider how other landscape properties and lithology are correlated with landscape morphology as well as with other factors like soil production and ecology. Okay, so we've been working on a framework to explain how climate, tectonics, as well as land cover affect the morphology of steep landscapes. And we found that the morphology of debris flow dominated valleys correlates well with uplift and erosion rates. And for moving forward, we hope that regional mapping of metrics like ADF will allow us to reveal spatial variations in uplift and erosion rate, but also, again, consider other factors like lithology, debris flow properties, as well as climate variability and vegetation. So there's a lot of ongoing work here and many open questions. I just want to focus in on two particular projects I would be excited to pursue here at UTIG, broadly related to linking process and form in steep landscapes under the broad umbrella of hazards. And the first is related to the question, can we infer coseismic subsidence along megathrust earthquakes from landscape morphology? So along subduction zones, a major hazard during megathrust earthquakes is from shaking, but also from coseismic subsidence. Coseismic subsidence is a hazard in and of itself because that subsidence can put topography below sea level, and that can persist for decades to centuries. But it also exacerbates the effect of any tsunami that's produced during the earthquake. Now, during the interseismic period, so the period between earthquakes, we often see the topography out near the trench subsides, whereas topography at the coast uplifts. During the coseismic period, so during the earthquake, we find that topography at the trench uplifts, so this is what usually creates the tsunami, and topography at the coast subsides. So again, the big question is here, can we use estimates of long-term uplift rate from topography to infer anything about coseismic subsidence? And there's some very early work from a paper from about 8 years ago now in a small postage stamp size portion of the Oregon Coast Range that suggests that if you couple long-term uplift rate measurements as estimated from topography with observations or models of interseismic uplift rate and take into account some characteristic earthquake recurrence interval, you can arrive at a coseismic subsidence value. And in that initial pilot study, the authors found that they could reproduce the subsidence values that were inferred from stratigraphy in estuaries along the coast. So I'm already planning with a co-PI at University of Washington to write a proposal to consider this question. And I also have interested collaborators at the USGS in Seattle, especially people who work on modeling shaking that we can expect during the next subduction zone earthquake, because any coseismic subsidence values that we're able to calculate with this sort of technique would then be would allow us to infer things like locking depth along the subduction zone, which is then important for inferring how much slip is going to occur during the next earthquake, and then how much shaking there is. Okay. Next, the geomorphology community for several decades now has been very interested in the question of divide migration. So if you go to a landscape, landscapes can adjust to perturbations in climate or tectonics in a couple ways. They can incise into bedrock, or they can aggrade sediment. These are vertical adjustments to tectonic and climatic perturbations. But watersheds can also adjust to those perturbations horizontally. So drainage divides can migrate and move over time. And we have metrics that we can use to predict the direction and the magnitude of divide migration, but most of those metrics are derived from the river network. But ultimately, drainage divides fall on the hill slope. So I'm in the second year of an NSF-funded project with my co-PI, Kristen Sweeney, where we've been going primarily out to the Oregon Coast Range to specifically consider this question of how well can hill slope morphology or hill slope morphometrics predict the magnitude and direction of divide migration, but importantly, how do hill slope processes and hill slope derived sediment feed back into the river network and affect the style and rate at which divides are moving. And we had our first field season this past summer in the Coast Range, digging a lot of soil pits. If anybody ever tells you they want to sieve the contents of dozens of soil pits that are over 2 meters deep, I would definitely encourage you to make sure they know what they're getting into. But it served as a great opportunity to get undergrads into the field and collect real data, and also then get them involved with analyzing those data after field work. But importantly, projects like this one also help inform how hill slope sediment transport, including sediment derived from landslides and grain size distributions, impact the rate at which divides move and feed back into the fluvial network, and importantly, defines our template for hazard in steep landscapes. Okay, so I just want to return to our space-time diagram again, just to re-emphasize how my work really spans each of these quadrants, including some projects that I didn't have time to talk about today. But all to say, I really want to make clear how excited I am by the multidisciplinary department within UTIG, and how I'd really look forward to the chance to collaborate with so many of you on processes that span such a wide range of these quadrants. And importantly, I think natural hazards is really a nexus for a wide range of fields, including surface processes and geomorphology, but also tectonics, climate science and hydrology, ecology, as well as engineering. And I'd be really thrilled to help integrate these different fields and build collaborations with so many of you. And with that, I'd like to thank you again for being here, and I'd be happy to take any of your questions.
Let's start with questions with Alice.
Hi, thanks so much for a great talk. I just had a question about kind of the first half of your work here. Why does it have to be a subduction zone earthquake? Why could it not be like a local earthquake that just happens to be right underneath the hill and that causes enough shaking to create the landslide?
The main reason is because we have the most information about that earthquake. There are some other shallow crustal fault earthquakes that may have triggered bedrock landslides, and in fact probably did. And a few of our bedrock landslide-dammed lakes fall close in age to a larger crustal fault earthquake that occurred primarily in Northern California, but the shaking was felt well to the north in Oregon as well. Unfortunately, the landslide-dammed lakes we dated that fall around that earthquake, we didn't have bark preserved, so we couldn't, narrow down to the year whether or not they were corresponding to that particular year. But that's definitely a possibility. And especially as you move further to the north, like up into Washington, there's a lot of similar landslide deposits up there, and there's a lot of active crustal faults. So there's definitely many possibilities around that as well. But we just know so much about the 1700 earthquake, it's kind of been the primary observational target.
I think I saw, oh yeah, go ahead. You right next to her.
Okay. Another question on the first half. How quickly do the lakes form, and is there any climatic dependence on how quickly those lakes form?
There would be a climatic dependence. Fortunately, it's a very wet landscape. There was one landslide-dammed lake that formed in 2017, and it formed over the matter of a few weeks. So there really shouldn't be much of a lag between like when the landslide occurs and when the lake fills, and then when the trees die. There was actually some experimental work on trees in the H.J. Andrews experimental forest in Western Oregon in the 1970s that showed when you submerge Douglas fir roots in water, they die in the matter of a few weeks. So the lake should fill quick, and then the tree should also die quick.
Thank you.
Let's go to Harm.
Hey, Doug. You mentioned a proposal to install accelerometers to measure the impact of a distant earthquake on hill slope processes. Since the Pacific Northwest has a lot of seismometers already, I was wondering if it's also not possible to even detect landslides seismically through the network, because they probably do show up. Have you ever thought of that or seen a study of that?
Yes, and actually there was a seismometer near Mount Hood, east of Portland, that picked up a landslide and a post-fire debris flow in 2021. So I had that picture of that debris flow deposit in 2021. A seismometer did pick up that. Now, for that proposal, we're not necessarily, I mean, if we get lucky, maybe we'll record an earthquake, but we're actually going to have to probably rely on wind energy being transmitted into the subsurface through the trees to try and pick out any particular band gaps that the trees introduce to the seismic waves.
Thank you.
In your debris flow model, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more as to what the model explains besides sort of basic mass balance, right? You would expect that erosion rate somehow controls what comes down the pipe. So in particular, compared to like a river incision law, right? How much different are these slopes, and how well can you fit secondary features?
So, I mean, the slopes tend to be much steeper. Now, there is sort of the question of like, where does the process transition happen? Like, is the morphologic transition point at ADF corresponding at all with the process transition point? So are like the steepest fluvial channels very similar to these debris flow channels? Now, one of the, I mean, to go back to your first question, like, what are we actually taking away? I mean, we're doing a lot of testing of different parameters related to the slope and the depth terms. So because the debris flows are inherently stochastic, how nonlinearly slope relates to erosion rate is very important, especially because we need to end up with slopes that are mostly invariant as you go to smaller and smaller drainage areas. And then also related to the sediment supply issue, our exponent on the depth terms related to volume. So how important is it that we actually have bigger debris flows in more rapidly up the catchments versus just having sort of a characteristic debris flow that applies across all watersheds? So I don't know if I have a specific answer to all of your questions, but these are like particular parameters that we're considering as we, think about other data we want to collect moving into the future related to scaling between debris flow volume and drainage area, or scaling between debris flow volume and landscape position within a 2D dendritic drainage network. So I guess hopefully someday I'll have a specific answer to that question. But...
I'll confess, I didn't know that there was an NSF program in geomorphology and land use dynamics. I was trying to figure out what GLD was, and you finally said that at the end. But this leads me to my question. How much are you talking to the land use people? What are you finding out that changes the way people view landscapes and how they use them?
Right. So that's a big question in the Pacific Northwest, especially related to timber harvesting. So that's the really big one in that particular landscape. So in the bedrock landslides work, you may notice that a lot of our landslide-dammed lake ages cluster in the 19th century, and then they really taper off in the 20th century. And one big question is, how does that relate to land use? Unfortunately, at this stage, a lot of the interaction with land use managers is sometimes a little hampered by the fact that if you work on landslides in the Pacific Northwest, they're a little reticent to collaborate with you because they're concerned that you're trying to link a landslide occurrence with timber harvesting. But the stability that we see of these landslide-dammed lakes in the 19th century, with then tapering off in the 20th century, raises a lot of interesting questions that I would love to work with land managers on, in terms of like, how does the lack of old growth wood now impact the stability of landslide-dammed lakes, the triggering of landslides. And I have collaborators at the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, and they have a lot of those relationships. But again, with the landslides, you kind of have to slowly work your way into their good graces to, actually address those kind of questions.
Thank you.
some of the data sets you use, like just laser topography or roughness, those are some kind of data set that are also very common on the Mars or the Moon. And I have a very broad question. Did you ever consider applying some of your techniques to planetary landscapes?
Yeah, definitely. So one particular question I've thought about is how does roughness tell us anything about sediment flux on hill slopes, especially related to creep and also being able to pull out bioturbation. So for the case of lunar hill slopes, how could any sort of like roughness-based measurement inform our understanding of creep on lunar hill slopes from like micrometeor impacts, for instance? I don't have any particular projects in the moment moving forward, but I definitely thought about ways to do that.
David.
I want to go back to the debris flows in your area of debris flow dominated channels versus erosion rate and look for some deeper meaning that's coming out of your relationships. Where you have the longer debris flow dominated channels, do you think that's because you're really systematically triggering bigger flows which have longer runoff, or is the higher erosion rates, uplift rates, actually just giving you more sites where these flows are actually occurring that integrate into a bigger area?
That's a very good question. And it's something that we desperately need more data on, because we're using the USGS post-fire debris flow model to parameterize debris flow volume. Debris flow volume in that model was derived from the outlets of these watersheds, and we're projecting it up towards the headwaters. Whether or not that's reasonable is a big question. So we need a lot more data on like how volume scales as you move upstream. But then, yeah, is that purely a volume question, or is that sort of a drainage network geometry question? So there's a paper from 2003 by Stock and Dietrich where in their debris flow process law, they had a parameter that controlled what they called trigger hollows. So basically the number of upstream debris flow sources was an important parameter. We have a 2D version of our model, and we think moving forward that we would have to include some sort of factor like that, because right now we can't deconvolve whether or not volume is related purely to bulking of one debris flow as you move downstream, or like aggregation of multiple flows as you move to larger drainage areas.
Okay, it looks like we're just about out of time for questions, so let's thank William once again.